And with that, welcome to webinar 3 of 6 in the Demystifying IRTs Admissions Process webinar series. Again, my name is Brittany Zorn. I'm the Arts and Sciences Program Specialist here with IRT, also a proud IRT alumna and going on my 6th year as a staff person. And I am here to lead this conversation with you with my colleague, Leslie.
I'm Leslie Godot-Solo, the Education Program Specialist. I am IRT class of 91. I'm going into my 20th year working in the IRT office.
And today we are going to take a deep dive into letters of recommendation or recommendations as part of the IRT application process. So as with previous webinars, here is our overview for today. We're going to take a look at some screenshots of the application itself, talk about the unique form that IRT uses in place of a generic letter of recommendation, talk about the who, the when, the how, the what of the letter of recommendation ask, and then wrap up with some familiar slides that you all have seen before.
Okay, so this is what the section for recommendations looks like on the IRT website, where you will make application. And you will need to include information on 3 recommenders, and that information would include their name and their email address.
Which is best articulated by this next slide here, which shows you exactly the information that is required of you to submit a letter of recommendation. So if you've already been inside the application, these pages must look pretty familiar to you by now.
Okay, so the recommendation form will ask your recommender to comment on a number of things, and those include your character, your commitment to diversity in education, and your competitiveness and readiness for graduate school. So under character, we're looking for resiliency, adaptability, definitely that you're open to feedback and can deal with constructive criticism. And we're also looking for a passion about the work that you want to do and or the field that you plan to pursue. In terms of diversity in education, we're looking for that to be present in a number of your research experiences, in your work experiences, in academic experiences, and then your professional goals. So your research deals with issues of diversity and or a lack of education in certain communities or so forth. You have work experience that also pertains to, that demonstrates your commitment to diversity and to educating and helping other individuals. It shows up in your academic coursework as well, you know, the varied courses that you have taken, and then in your professional goals. So in terms of the competitiveness, we're looking for the recommender to talk about your critical thinking and analytical skills and your ability to make a significant contribution to your particular field.
Fantastic. I think the one thing I would just add, in case we didn't say this already, is that, you know, IRT uses a specific form, right? Like it has 10 Likert scale questions and I think maybe 5 or 6 short answer questions. That's pretty atypical. Most applications would just ask for a generic letter of recommendation, right? Just, you know, professors are pretty accustomed to writing letters of rec. But we want to be more targeted, and you know what, we're soliciting information from letters of recommendation writers, which is why we went over all the points that Leslie just highlighted. It's to specifically pull out, you know, aspects of your character, commitment to diversity and education, and competitiveness and readiness for graduate school. That's why we have a particular form, so that we can really highlight these 3 things from recommenders. Okay, so that's what we want to know about you from recommenders. So who do you ask to write you a letter of recommendation? We require 3 total, as you saw from the screenshots of the application at the front of this presentation. And in other places, we've also articulated this, that at least 2 of those 3 letters of or recommendations must be academic. So that means from a professor, and there is a hierarchy of who is considered a strong letter writer within academia, within higher education, within graduate education. And so that hierarchy is listed here: full professor, professor, emeritus, associate, assistant. These are the top. And then visiting, means that, okay, they typically have many years of professoring, but they might not be, permanent at that institution. So that's okay. Then lecturer, teaching assistant, graduate assistant, TA, those are less considered like less, what do I want to say, competitive or less professional, slightly less reputation comes behind those titles or with people who are occupying those positions. And then adjunct instructor being kind of the lowest of the low in terms of the hierarchy of who's considered a strong letter writer. But obviously we're leading towards tenured professors, full professors. Mm-hmm. I think it's worth adding that there's also a hierarchy based on like how long you've known the person. So if you've taken 1 class with a full professor, that letter may not be as strong as a lecturer with whom you've taken 3 classes or something like that. This is all, subject to an individual's circumstances and relationship with these individuals. And there's always exceptions. So if you're sitting here thinking like, oh, geez, I don't have like strong relationships with any tenured professors, or I just transferred, or I did 2 years at a community college and now I'm finishing at my undergraduate at a 4-year institution and my relationships aren't as strong, or all of those life circumstances that could be coming up in this, like that's all totally okay and appropriate and to be expected. IRT is pretty flexible in terms of what we accept and what we consider a strong letter. This is us sort of replicating the graduate school admissions process for y'all's benefit, right? This is us saying, hey, in just a few months' time, you're going to need to identify these folks and ask them to write for your graduate school applications also. So be thinking about these dynamics and who is considered a strong letter writer. All of that being said, the 3rd letter of recommendation could be a professional recommendation or from a professional connection. So could be from a leadership role you've held, a supervisory role that either you've held or that, someone supervised you in a particular role, or a colleague, a professor, a professional peer or mentor. Again, these are in sort of the hierarchy of what is considered strongest. So a director, a principal, a superintendent, and a manager, a direct supervisor. These are all the strongest professional recommendations you could have. But, if you had a colleague who you've been working with for a couple of decades, or, a peer who you collaborated with on a lot of projects that are super relevant to the work that you want to do, and they could really speak to your ability to serve diverse students or your commitment to addressing issues of diversity, equity, inclusion, and education, then that could also be appropriate. I think the big takeaway here is like, what is that person's relationship like to you? So right there, these are sort of the industry standards around like who's considered the strongest and most reputable people to ask and write letters on your behalf. But it really does come down to like, what is this person's ability to speak to your skills and experience? How well does this person understand your goals and can advocate for your potential in a particular discipline or role? That is ultimately, especially for IRT's purposes, the thing that we consider most highly.
Can I just add, for the first column, the lecturer, the graduate and teaching assistant, and adjunct instructor, I wouldn't get caught up on the order of that. Like, I think in some cases, if you could order this with the adjunct instructor and the lecturer down below. It depends on the education and the experience they have. The graduate teaching assistantship could be a master's candidate, but that adjunct instructor might be someone who is ABD ABD is all but dissertation. So they are working towards their PhD, they've done all their coursework, but they have not written that big paper that eventually they turn into their first book usually. So don't, the main thing is that the ideal situation is that you want professors who are in those 5 categories of emeritus, full, associate, assistant, visitor. And then these last 3 can be, the order of them may be interchangeable is what I'm saying. Okay.
Perfect. I think that is super appropriate, or what am I trying to say? Like relevant information to be thinking about.
Yeah, so just don't get caught up on, oh, well, one or the other. Yeah. So then who do you ask? How to ask, rather. We just discussed who to ask. This is how to ask, and the etiquette that you want to use to begin to cultivate or to complement the relationship and ask for these letters. So you definitely want to send an email. You want to send an email and you want to say hello. I would definitely email them with, if they are a doctor, email them, dear Dr. So-and-so. If they're Mrs. or Miss, if you know they're Mrs., married, use that. If you're unsure, then I would do a MS, okay, or Mr., Doctor. But yes, I would be more, what's the word I'm looking for? I would be more formal, thank you, than informal, just to be on the safe side. And you want to say something like, I hope this email finds you well. I trust that you are well. I hope you and your family are well. I'm stuck on well. Wishing you a warm holiday season. Whatever the season might be, it could be Happy New Year, for example. And if you haven't spoken to them in a while, do a little chat about what you might be up to as it relates to the work that you want to do, maybe classes you're taking since you last saw them, or you might ask about perhaps the last time you saw them, they told you they were traveling to so-and-so. You might say, well, I remember when we spoke last, you were going to X, Y, and Z. How was that trip? Make it personable is what we're trying to get at. Do give them an explanation of what the IRT is and why you want to be part of IRT. That could be that you type something up. It could be that perhaps you copy something from our website, but some kind of description so they know and get a sense of what IRT is and what we do and how you fit into that. And then you want to send them an updated resume, CV, one or the other, and your transcript so they can remember, so they can see the courses that you've taken. I would also list the courses that you've had with them, and you can just say, my courses with you included X, Y, and Z. So in the names of those courses so they can easily reference that. And then you want to share your career and research interests as well.
I think when we're talking about if you have not spoken to your recommender in a while, this is particularly for our non-traditional applicants, right? So I think maybe it was Thursday's webinar, someone asked specifically about being out of school for some time. Like, well, what if I've been out the, full-time student game for 10 years or more? How do I go about this application and et cetera? So I think in particular, when we're talking about like professional etiquette and like adding in a small anecdote and like updating them about your goals, like this is especially relevant if you've been out of school for some time. Dear Dr. So-and-so, like, I hope you've been well since spring 2009 when I graduated, LOL, it's been a little time. Like, I hope that, you've been able to stay safe in this pandemic. Like, I've been doing this as a job for this amount of time. in this question of graduate schools come up a few times, and now I found this program IRT that would help me apply, right? Like, you want it to be a little bit of like a narrative. You want it to be a little bit of like, I'm writing you a letter, and we're old friends and we haven't spoken in a little bit. And that's the implication here when we're talking about etiquette and personal anecdotes and providing updates, because all of that will help them, make it easier for them to say, yeah, I can write you a letter. You've given me all this information, even though we haven't been in class together since 2012, something like that.
Dan has a question.
Oh, yeah.
Is there any advice on how to ask for developing a summer research opportunity if we never had formal research experience in our field? I definitely think you can do that. So as Brittany talked about the beginnings of that letter, that could be used to say, how are you? The last time we spoke, it's been a little while. I've been up to X, Y, and Z. And I also am contemplating graduate school. And as I think about that, in my discussions with IRT and just me thinking about this process, I realized that I don't have research experience. I'm wondering if you are aware of any organizations or colleagues who may be looking for a research assistant, and open it up in that way.
Definitely agree that this is a prime opportunity. You could frame it as something like, I really enjoyed your class on X, Y, and Z when I took it. And, the paper that I had to write around these topics was really interesting. Like, if you're doing any work that's similar to that at this current time, I would love to talk about the opportunity to collaborate on that or assist you with any projects you may have forthcoming. So you can definitely use this as an opener for sure. Okay, when to ask. Awesome, you're very welcome. So at this point, we are maybe like a little over a month from the application deadline. So if you haven't already asked these folk, you need to ask them. It needs to happen soon. This webinar series, I think, is intended to happen a little bit earlier on, much farther away from the March 1st deadline, so that we could be having this discussion of, oh, it's September. Should I ask them now? Should I ask them in December? Like, when should I ask? When you're less than 2 months away from a deadline like that, you should ask. Like that's kind of like the window of time where you want the recommender to be able to actually work on something, or to be able to have follow-up conversations with them about what your goals are. Maybe they want to schedule a brief Zoom. Maybe they're going to ask you for particular materials that you didn't already provide. So yes, now is the time. But more time is always better than less. So just in the broadest view, if you're thinking about, oh, when do I ask my eventual graduate school recommenders also, like, not just thinking about the IRT deadline, that's March 1st. Sooner is better. You can always like get verbal confirmation 6 months ahead of time, and then just as the deadline gets closer, have different touch points throughout. Oh, hey, a month has passed. I've done this work now. I wanted to share with you. Thanks again for agreeing to write with me. Oh, the semester's starting now. I hope you've been well. I just wanted to reiterate that I'm so thankful that you're willing to write a letter that's due in 2 months. And then you just kind of have these touch points as you get closer to the deadline. For IRT, it may be useful to give your recommenders an earlier deadline, since we are in that like sweet spot of asking. So, maybe you are transparent and say, the IRT application deadline is March 1st, but my personal deadline is February 20th. So if you would be willing to meet the deadline of February 20th so that my application could be completed in full by this date, that, thank you so much, something like that.
You also want to leave yourself a little bit of leeway time if you have to follow up with them. If you go to the IRT website, and this is in the next slide, but you can see who has submitted the letters of reference. And if they haven't, if you look on the 21st and they still haven't uploaded, you still have a little bit of leeway to reach out and say, hey, I need this yesterday. Can you get it up? And so that's why we suggest that you make the deadline with them a bit earlier than the actual deadline. So then you can see, again, as we said, you'll be able to see who has submitted, and then you'll know. So that is something that you want to pay attention to. You know, if you have a professor that you know is kind of always last minute, you want to be checking this so that you're not needlessly like tracking them down and, you know, saying, I need it, I need it, I need it.
Which you will inevitably have to do for some application for some professors at some point. But I did see a hand raised, so go ahead, Eric. Feel free to ask your question.
Thank you. And thank you again for all this insider intel that you guys are providing here.
Of course.
I have a quick question about the application, the recommendation deadlines. So I've reached out to everyone, my 3 recommenders. They're all very agreeable to writing the recommendations. However, I am a little concerned that, I mean, these people are all reliable, so I'm sure that they will definitely get them by March 1st.
Mm-hmm.
But should I have to nudge them and, you know, something may come, like, ultimately, is the application going to close on the 1st? Or like, if you receive, how aggressive do I need to be if they don't have something in by, you know, February 25th?
It's a great question, and you should be fairly aggressive in following up with them, because we do try to honor the March 1st deadline every single year and like truly cut it off and say, you know, we've provided a lot of supports, like we understand that life happens, but we also want to, you know, be able to move forward with our process and honor everyone's applications who did get in on time. And so March 1st is a pretty hard deadline. Like there's not going to be any like extensions or grace periods for like, oh yeah, like you can chase that straggler for 2 weeks into March, and as long as they get it in, like you're good. That's not the case.
So then I guess one follow-up would be, just hypothetically, if you received 2 out of 3, that's considered an incomplete application, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, cool.
I think there is a little bit of grace if this is an issue and you're in communication with IRT proactively, right? Like if there's, if you're like, it's February 20th and this recommender said they would submit, but they haven't, I'm chasing them down, then, you know, we're more agreeable to allow a little bit of grace for someone who's like already set a precedent or been in touch or had like this chain of communication open around an issue, versus on the 1st or on the 28th saying, like this person didn't submit, and like, is there any possibility? And like, you know, like I've been chasing them down. Like that does not reflect as well or endear us as strongly to like, you know, extend any graciousness, versus, you know, oh yeah, it's the 14th and I told my recommenders to submit, you know, this week. I haven't, I'm just putting this out there. So, and I think this is a good best practice for any application going forward. But, you know, a graduate school, typically like a graduate program, like there's not going to be a grace period for that. It's like, if you don't get it in on the deadline, like they've got 300 other applications, right, that they're happy to review that are complete. So it is a good best practice to internalize for yourself. Deadlines are hard. There's not a lot of grace for recommenders. Do whatever prepping with them and nudging with them that will help them get to the deadline on time.
And I would say too, and this is probably a given, Eric, but you want to make sure that all of your pieces are in as well. Because a lot of times we have a student that'll be like, well, my professors recommend, you know, they're dragging their feet, blah, blah, blah. But the student is also missing pieces, you know, and so it's like, when you're talking about the professor, you haven't even done what you're supposed to do.
Yep.
And now you want a further extension. So I just wanted to add that too. I know that won't be your case and your situation.
Right, that won't be, yeah, exactly. It won't be anyone on this
Did everything
I mean,
you're
the only
supposed to.
reason why I really asked was because there have been other applications, fellowships, for example, where like the application for the applicant, you know, the student in this case, is different than the recommender. So I want to make sure that this is all a hard deadline. So like,
Yes.
I have everything in by March 1st, no later.
Yes.
Perfect. Yeah,
Thank you.
that's great. Thank you for your diligence. And with that, that pretty much concludes what we have to say about recommendations. You've seen this slide before. This is how you actually submit your application. You must attend an info session. The recording for the generic info session is available on the website. You can turn in your application on the website as well, all due by March 1st, including a resume, CV, official transcripts, your essays, and your recommendations. And then after the 1st, we invite everyone with a completed application to participate in a 30-minute virtual interview. This is a quick caveat for everybody around the contact info here and around some of the questions that we had in the last 2 webinars. So we truly mean to contact IRT@andover.edu if you're having any issues with the application, any technical issues, not seeing pages you're supposed to see, you know, not able to skip something you're supposed to be able to skip, a question about what you're supposed to put in a particular box. Definitely email directly to IRT@andover.edu, and our colleague Sarah, who manages the actual physical application system itself, is the most equipped to be able to troubleshoot with you. And I spoke with her after last week's session, and I do have some specific responses to the questions that folks asked, although I don't think I saw any of our question askers in attendance today necessarily. So if you have any kind of issue at all, take a screenshot, send it to IRT@andover.edu, and you can even say, like, I've been attending the webinars. Brittany told me to email you if I have an issue. I've attached a screenshot of my issue. Here's my question. And like that, especially now in these weeks, you know, before the last couple of weeks in February, now is a great time to troubleshoot application issues.
Mhm.
And that's all she wrote, folks.
Brittany, can you share what Sarah said about certain questions that were asked in the previous webinar?
Oh yeah, I see some of our question askers have popped in now since I'm out of my share screen. So the 3 questions that I recorded last time were, I don't see a tab visible for the application essays. Now, Sarah shared a screenshot with me of what that should look like, and I can just even do a quick screen share to share that. And so this is the screenshot that she shared with me of the application, you know, what it would look like for a student. And if you look on the left-hand side here, arts and science and social sciences essays and education essays are tabs. So if you're not seeing those, that would certainly raise an eyebrow, but also this particular question right here, what field does your graduate program of interest fall under, determines which sets of essay questions are viewable for you when you move through the application. So if you chose arts and sciences, then you're going to see the arts and sciences questions later on. If you chose both, you would see both in the order of arts and sciences and then education. And if you chose education, you would only see education. So, as you complete each page and you hit save and next, those answers are dependent or determine what you're going to see later on in this instance, particularly when it comes to the essays. So if you can say to Sarah, look, Sarah, I've answered arts and sciences here on this part of the application, but then I go to essays and it's only showing me education essays, Sarah can troubleshoot with the application maker itself, which is PCR. You can see at the bottom, it says powered by PCR. So Sarah has like a direct line to PCR. So if like an individual student is having a particular issue like that, then she can troubleshoot with that. And then the last thing that Sarah said would be to use the email address that you used in the application, right? So if you used bzorn@Andover, email Sarah from bzorn@Andover so she can actually search for your application portal, like on the back end. And then there was another question. I do see we have a hand raised. There was another question about, it was about what to put in the ethnicity box. And so that we made a note of that where she was able to like say like specify or self-identify there. So that should also be clearer going forward. But those were the 3 questions. No visible tab for essays. When I select education, it brings up arts and sciences. And then what do I put in the the text box next to the ethnicity question. So yes, those are it. Okay, I'm going to stop talking. Erin, would you like to ask your question?
Yes.
And then Tatiana,
when you showed I think Tatiana may have been first then.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I just happened to see Erin first. But if you guys want to rocks, paper, scissors for it, we'll get you both.
Okay. I'm sorry. Hey, I'm awkward. I have a question about when you showed the screenshot where it said there's a both option, whether you could do education or both. And I have a question for my major. I'm interested in like linguistics and also communication sciences, but also maybe possibly professorship. Should I do both or just choose which one?
It's a great question. So the question is specifically asking about where your field is situated. So even though you might like to teach linguistics or communications or something similar, you might like to hold a teacher role around that. The field itself is for sure arts and social sciences, right? Like that is definitively not a field in education, because the education fields are like, right, like higher education, education leadership, masters of arts of teaching, school counseling, right? Like those are like definitive fields within education versus something like linguistics or communication or literature-esque or language related, that is definitively arts and sciences. So that's the one you would choose.
Agreed.
Gotcha. Thank you so much, Brittany.
Okay, perfect. And then, sorry, Tatiana, please ask your question.
No worries. Hi, everybody. I wanted to just clarify something. I know I'm always asking this question, so I'm sorry. But I have my situation is a little unique. I was a non-traditional student, and I ended up returning to school many years later, finishing my undergrad and going straight into my master's. So in that time, being an adult, I've had to also work and go to school and do all of that. But while, I've managed to find jobs working with my professors who have also acted not just as my professors, but my supervisors and managers and working in academia. So when it comes to getting recommenders, I know you guys specify 2 professors and 1 professional. Mine, I feel like, are going to be mixed. I don't know if it's like I don't know how I should designate this or how I should go about it.
I mean, my initial thought to this is that's fantastic if they fall in both categories, then you don't really need to worry about the 2-in-1 kind of like breakdown. What is most important about the 2-in-1 breakdown is that academic or letters of recommendation from professors is the golden standard, right? Like it, especially for graduate school, it's going to be expected that you have letters of recommendation from at least 2 professors. Like that's like bare minimum. Doesn't matter who you are, where you're coming from, or what your life is like that's going to be kind of like the bar that you need, the threshold that you need to pass. So if you have someone who's professor and supervisor, or professor and mentor, or professor and colleague, then that's cool. Then you check the 2 academic minimum box. The 1 professional is like, you would not want to submit more than 1 recommendation from someone who's only seen you in a professional capacity. Like, you wouldn't want to submit 2 recommendations from 2 people who've only ever seen you in sort of a formal professional setting. Unless, like we could talk about that, because you're like, oh, I've been out of school for 20 years, all I have is supervisors. But it's like that's appropriate for IRT. But once you're admitted to IRT, we would talk about cultivating rapport with former professors and how to intentionally identify people from your academic experiences who you could invite to write letters of recommendation for you. Because truly, for like a PhD program especially, it really is gonna be expected that you have at least 2 professors with whom you have a strong enough relationship who could write on your behalf. And they might not even be current professors, but like, do they have PhDs? Like, did they serve in academia, right? Like that's gonna be important. Does that clarify?
Yeah, a little bit.
Well, let me see if I could add. So you know, what we're looking for is definitely a professor, but the graduate schools will want to know that this person has taught you. So they want to know from this person who you are as an academic individual, you know, so that the professor can talk about that this student had a class with me, they wrote insightful papers, they always seem to have comments that clarify issues or concerns. They were, you know, gracious with students who perhaps had not seen this kind of reading before and would often, you know, sit with them or meet with them to help them discern what the class material entailed. And then I would say for those, you know, that overlap, so they, you know, you said you have a mentor, you have a supervisor, they can talk about your academics, but they also can talk about, so your coursework, but then they also may be able, maybe this is the person that you conduct research with. They can also talk about how you are in the lab, you know, and that you're a leader in the lab, that they can give you a project and you run with it. You need little supervision. The other person who may be a supervisor, or not a supervisor, but think of another,
Manager.
a manager, you know, can talk about the courses and how you are as a student, but also talk about, again, your leadership skills, your initiative, you know, things that the graduate school would find important.
Okay, that clears it up. Okay, thank you so much, ladies.
You're welcome.
And never apologize for asking questions.
Definitely.
Someone else undoubtedly is wondering the same thing. I mean, I think for IRT, we're super flexible and we're super empathetic and understanding, especially for our non-trad folk. But like, we're gonna get to like, if you're with IRT and you're applying to grad school, like you definitely need 2 professors. Like it's like, you know, especially for a PhD program, like no PhD program they're gonna raise a big eyebrow if you don't have at least 2 letters from 2 professors from some part of your journey, right? No matter what your relationship is like with those professors. So that's why we break it down like that. Yeah.
Other questions, concerns, thoughts?
Yeah, I would say I have a thought. You all have done in your tone and your presentation and the information that you all have intentionally done. You've effectively demystified this application process for me. However, now we talk about letters of recommendation. I'm like, golly, and I hear it. I hear the intention around mimicking, you know, grad or PhD programs. I guess aside from some of the email language that you, Ms. Leslie, had put forth, and then when we reach out to folks we haven't connected with in a while, how else would you advise someone? I mean, I haven't been in school. I graduated like 16 years ago.
Okay. Okay.
Like how would I, some of those professors are retired, aren't living anymore, are moved on. Just a lot of things. So how would you advise I navigate that?
Yeah, I mean, there does come a time when, you know, on occasion we do have a student that can't find the second person. And Brittany, correct me if I'm wrong, what I think we end up doing is going with individuals that you can find. And one of the things that you could do on the applications is there's usually a section for affidavit where you can put extenuating circumstances, and you could let them know that you've been out of school for such and such years. You know, your professors are long retired and no longer in academia, have passed away. You know, you did your best to find folks that could speak to all of the concerns that they had, but only one of them is a professor. And I think you know, folks realize that that happens, but I still believe that they'll read your application, and that's why you want to make all of the other parts of it stellar. You know, for what you can control it, write the best essays,
Mhm.
you know, get the recommenders. This is particularly important for the graduate school recommendations, because as Brittany said, our recommendation is a Likert scale, 10 Likert questions and short essays. But
Mhm.
for the graduate school recommendation, you don't want to pick the professor who only writes a paragraph, right? They're not, the graduate school's not interested in that generic. What we see is, you know, definitely a page-long letter, single spaced, sometimes, you know, 2 pages, double spaced. And on some occasions, like a 3-page letter, you know, but that's someone who perhaps has worked with that student since their freshman year, and maybe they're in a Mellon program or McNair program, and this person has been more or less seeing this student's progress all along
Mhm.
the time they've been an undergraduate. Okay, so that's what I would, that's the suggestion that I would make. Brittany may have some other thoughts.
Yeah, I do have some other thoughts that I'm trying to put together. So I've definitely worked with students in the last couple of years who are in a similar situation where they're like, I don't, one professor is hard to identify. So there's a couple ways you can get around this. I think part of what will help this is to think about applying to PhD programs, because you're applying to PhDs, right, Amir? Yep, okay. So to think about applying to PhD programs, not as like a 6-month thing, but as like, okay, I'm someone who's been out of school for a long time. Maybe I take a longer view at what it's going to take for me to get competitive and apply in my fullest preparedness. And I'm not saying this to discourage you. I'm just saying these are some of the conversations I have with scholars, even after they're admitted to IRT. And it's like, we on the ship is sailing. Like, you got applications due, we got to figure it out, right? Like, and we're having these conversations now. So it could mean that it would be useful to you to consider taking classes, like taking a graduate class or taking some undergraduate classes that are relevant to your interests. Like maybe your job can reimburse you. Maybe you have taken professional development with people who are at institutions and you could connect with presenters. Hey, I sat in on your Whiteness at Work webinar last fall, and I see that you teach at yada yada and you do X, Y, and Z, and your work's really interesting, and I'm looking to get back into school. And you could start to cultivate relationships that way. You know, and I say like maybe you could take a class or two, like an online class or a summer class or something, and get reimbursed for it with the intention of developing a strong relationship with that professor, right? Like, hey, I took this summer course, I did this small research project, I worked really closely with this professor, and now they're able to write for my PhD applications for the forthcoming cycle. It could be that you know colleagues or have peers professionally who have graduate degrees or who have connections, you know, within education, and maybe you can say like, hey, like, you know, so and so from the cubicle next door, like, you have a master's degree, where'd you get your degree from? Like, do you have relationship with faculty there? Like, would you be willing to introduce me? Could I have a sort of informational interview with this professor who I could just talk to about pursuing a PhD, like introduce myself, introduce IRT, you know, some crazy lady on a webinar told me I should start to try to create connections with you. Like, would you be willing to have a conversation with me and talk about like when you pursued your degree and that sort of thing? So I don't say any of this to discourage you from applying this year, right? Like, it still could be totally possible for you to be successful this fall in an application cycle, but like it could be that maybe we just need to take a longer view to the PhD application, right? Like, okay, I can't just go from 16 years as a professional in 6 months, switch to, you know, being ready to be a full-time student again. Maybe I need
Yeah,
to take like a year view to this.
absolutely. No, that, I mean, that's real. I appreciate that. I'm not at all discouraged. I mean, listen, I think y'all have our best interests at heart. I do have some folks in a professional setting I've built some relationships with, if I can just touch back with them. Yeah, that was all very, very helpful. Thank you for that.
Perfect. Yeah. Yeah, exactly, Tatiana. It's that is the way. Like it could be at like a third. By the time you get to a professor, it might be that like my colleague told me about a friend who took a class with you, and I know that you do work that matters to me, that I'm interested in. You know, I did some Googling, I saw you did a TED Talk, or I read this paper you wrote. It's really exciting. Like, would you be willing to have a conversation with me about what I should be doing to prepare for this PhD? Or like, you know, do you have the time? It's about relationships, just like anything else, right? Like we live in a who you know kind of world, but like especially academia, it's a small world out here. It's like only 40% of eligible Americans have college degrees, and that number like shrinks even to a fraction of that for graduate school, right? It's something like 10% or something, like tiny, tiny. And then for people of color, it's even tinier, 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 you know, and then in education, it's even tinier, tiny, tiny. So it's like, it's a really, really small world. So it is about rapport, relationships, people. You know, if you just click with somebody, maybe that professor's like, you know what, I'm gonna let you audit a summer class I'm doing this summer. I don't know you from Joe. You didn't go to my school. We're in different states, but I hear your goals and I'm doing this thing. It's 6 weeks. You can just, you know, you won't turn in any assignments. You won't be graded, you won't get credit, but you can audit it and you can participate and we can develop rapport and I can, you know, be able to write for you intelligently. So
Thank you for that. That's a great suggestion.
cheers. Yeah, you're welcome. Other thoughts, ruminations, reflections, qualms, queries, inquiries. I'm gonna have to get something down that I just repeat, like, you know, like some sort of like a little rap or something, just like a little ditty.
I do have a question, not necessarily related to this particular workshop, but more so the actual program.
Sure.
I have a number of my peers have gone through IRT and speak very highly of it. One thing that they definitely emphasized was the particular attention that IRT pays on writing samples for applications. I'm wondering how that would translate virtually, like how you've made that work during the pandemic when previously it would have been, you know, more face-to-face interactions.
So are you saying the critiquing of the statement of purpose?
I don't think it was the statement of purpose that they were.
I'm sorry, the writing sample.
The writing sample, yeah.
The critique.
Yeah, so the, you know, from what I understand, it was, you know, you were supposed to come equipped with a writing sample, and then that was going to be heavily critiqued by your faculty, and that was like a sort of a shining star of the program, in addition to everything else that you guys offer.
Oh goodness. Okay, so let me back up a little bit on that. The writing sample, particularly at the PhD level, is very important. Mm-hmm. And it should be something that is closely related to the topic and the research that you want to do as a PhD candidate. In terms of the critique that we do of that, it's very cursory. We only really look at the first couple of pages and the last few. The reason being is that we just don't have time with looking at all of your statements. We look very closely at your resume or CV. We look at any personal or diversity essays very closely. And we kind of make the assumption that your writing sample a lot of times might be your undergraduate thesis or your master's thesis. And so it's been pretty vetted by the professors that you were studying with in terms of its content and, you know, methodology, and so forth. But what students also may do is they may take it to a writing center. They may get a friend to look it over. They may ask one of their professors, could they review it? Particularly, and the other thing I would say too is a lot of times you have comments from professors that you haven't incorporated. I would definitely incorporate the critique of the professor who gave you back the paper. You know, most of us, we get our paper back, we look for the B or A and we're done. But the professor has written all over it and asked questions and so forth. So I would also say utilize that to revise the paper and then send it out, you know, ask a professor to read it, or like I said, a friend or another student that you may be a colleague with in the McNair program, or, you know, if you're on a college campus still and you're in some kind of program that's academic in nature, like McNair, Mellon, something of that caliber.
Yeah, this is interesting that you're asking about the like intense scrutiny that writing samples get. I'm like, who got that special treatment? Because I know that I don't be reading none of my students writing samples cover to cover like that. So whoever is reporting that they got intense scrutiny on a writing sample from IRT, I imagine that that was with an SOP advisor, an alumni SOP advisor who maybe was in the field.
Yeah.
You know, so, and I know that we've talked about this in other places, but just for the sake of this recording, if you're joining us here for the first time, everyone in IRT gets 2 advisors. You get an IRT staff advisor who's with you for the full 10 months and guides you through kind of everything. And then you get an SOP advisor whose goal is just to work with you for 2 months in the fall on your written materials, like your SOP, your writing sample, and your other things that Leslie was describing. So in that instance, we hire back a lot of alumni who like have disciplinary specialization that we don't have as staff. Most of us as staff have education backgrounds. And that's why we're working for a little education nonprofit, because like that's like, you know, what our professional interests are. But like, you know, someone with a PhD in anthro and a writing sample in anthropology, I could read it. I could probably tell you if it makes sense, or like, you know, give you grammatical feedback, but like I can't necessarily tell you about like the strength of the analysis for compared to the discipline, or compared to what other scholars are saying in the field, or like, is this truly anthropological in scope, or is it more interdisciplinary, right? Like my ability to comment on that is limited. Like, I mean, I have a general sense from having done this for a few years. So I imagine that whoever is like, yeah, they tore my writing sample up, was probably someone in the discipline who like could do that, right? Like a professor, a graduate student, someone who could really speak to that kind of like in-depth feedback. That is above and beyond the scope of what we expect from SOP advisors, because as Leslie described, most writing samples are 10 plus pages. It just would not be possible for me to serve 20 SOP advisees and commit to reading 20-page papers on top of 7+, you know, school specific statements on purpose, on top of, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that would be a little bit in addition to, you know, we do a conversation about the writing sample. Well, when did you write this? Who did you write this for? When was the last time you edited it? Was it revised? What grade did you receive, right? Like we can evaluate which papers might be better used. We can do preliminary reads. Oh, I read the first few pages. I read these chapters. I think these sections are stronger. But that would not be typical to have a really in-depth read of a writing sample. And then the last thing I'll just say before I get off my soapbox is you asked about how is it different in pandemic times, right? Like, is it a different level of evaluation or feedback because it's being done virtually? The short answer is no, because our advising has always been done virtually. You know, very few people who've gone through the IRT have been able to be in person with us during the summer workshop. And that experience is only 4 weeks out of the whole 10 months that we work with students. And so it's only about 30 students who've come to campus as part of the summer workshop. Our cohorts have been upwards of 100 for the last, you know, half a dozen or so years. So it really is like a small percentage of folks who get something in person with IRT, whereas most of our advising for most of the history of our program has been done over the phone. And then most recently it's been done video conference style, because the pandemic is pushing that into fashion a lot faster. So I hope that between Leslie and I officially answered all parts of your question.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'll definitely have to follow up with them and see what exactly they meant when they were saying that they were scrutinized. I'm not necessarily worried about it. You know, I am a Mellon Fellow. I also like have multiple mentors. So my writing, I'm not concerned about it. I just thought that was interesting that that was the feedback that came back several times. So I was like, I need to see about this. But I appreciate you clarifying. So thank you.
Perfect. I'm like, I want to know. You send those people to me. I want to know who's out there talking about this. I'm like, who did what? What year were you?
Well, you know, as we say that, I'm thinking of like an instance where that may have happened in my case. And so it would be for our education majors who are often applying to masters. Their papers typically can be a little shorter, you know, like 5 pages. So if they had a 5-pager, you know, by the time I read, you know, 1 or 2 on the front or on the back, it just makes sense to read the whole thing. So I have done that, you know, if it's like a 5-pager and
Totally.
I get started or, you know, I get interested in it, you know, really, I was like, oh, okay. You
That's
know,
really what it is, Leslie, is you just get on a roll. You're like, this student is brilliant. And then 15 pages later.
you know, and I mean, you know, 5 pages you can go through. Like I said, if you're going to read 1 or 2 on either side of it,
Yeah.
you just read the 3 in the middle, right? So that has been a case.
And I mean, I think we can, the last thing we'll say on this is like, as requested, it's totally like I've had students who've specifically said, I don't have anyone else who's read this. Like, will you read my writing sample? And I'm like, okay, but you got to give me 2 weeks. You know, I can't like turn it around for next week's meeting because I got, you know, all these other things happening in between. But if you send it to me in September, you know, September 10th, yeah, I can read it and, you know, give you some thoughts by September 28th. Like, that's totally reasonable. I can, you know, read in between things. So the possibility for getting scrutiny on a writing sample is absolutely present as well. It's just not built into the expectations of our SOP advising. Yeah.
Yeah, that's, yeah.
Is the horse dead or do other
The
thoughts?
horse?
I know the poor metaphorical horse.
Oh.
Anything else folks are thinking about or wondering at this point? I've really come to expect to see you all, you know, like on
Yeah,
Thursday. I was like, I can't
we
wait
look
to
forward
see.
to it. Yeah, we look forward to it. So our next session is, I'm pulling up my calendar. Next session.
Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern.
Yep, Thursday at 3. And that one will be about resume, CV, and transcripts.
Which I believe we're calling the components of your academic background.
Mhm.
All right, y'all. Well, you're fantastic. Keep being fantastic. We will, as you know, these are on YouTube. And if you don't see us here on Thursday, we'll see you on YouTube.
Be well, everyone. Take care. Happy Tuesday.
Thank you.